Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Veronica, and I'm currently doing a PhD researching narratives of self-harm here in the Welcome Centre. I'm really thrilled to be here, and so thank you to Bathsheba for inviting me to talk about a topic that is really close to me and that I think is really important and interesting. So there's an awful lot of research and theory that tells us, in a way that probably chimes with the way that a lot of us intuitively feel, that the stories we tell and listen to and watch can and do have an impact on the material facts of our lives, on our experiences and on our own ideas. And so that means that stories and narratives are important to pay attention to, that they can hold great power, but can also be spaces of great possibility. But I think it's also important to hold on to the fact that that relationship between narratives and experience can be one of great complexity, and in some ways uncertainty too, because although we know that that relationship exists, sometimes it's really hard to get a clear sense of what it is. For instance, there's a lot of academic writing grounded in the belief that individual stories can contribute to and be impacted by larger cultural narratives and ideas which determine things that we take for granted. For instance, the assumption that people are mentally healthy, or that mental good health means an ability to work well and efficiently. And this suggests that part of the reason it's important to pay attention to stories is that they might, sometimes without us even recognising it, contribute to ways of thinking or talking that might be harmful and not necessarily true. And this might impact not only how we talk about other people, and perhaps even what actions we take, but it can impact how we see ourselves and how we understand ourselves. So one of the things I'm really interested in is what it means to have an experience that it's hard to make sense of. And how we might use the stories that are around us, that we read or watch, to help us make sense of that experience, and then to help us tell the story of that experience, perhaps to someone else, if that's what we want, but perhaps just to ourselves, because that's important too. And so this is particularly interesting to me when we come to consider self-harm, how few stories there are about it. Self-harm is common within the population. It's estimated that about 10% of young people self-harm at some point, and recent studies are investigating the possibility that it's becoming more common. Yet self-harm rarely occurs in literature. Even authors such as Jacqueline Wilson, who are keen to take on thorny social issues, avoid self-harm. And it seldom features on TV shows or in films. And when it does appear, it's often not for any sustained amount of time. And I think that it's possible that that has to do with how upsetting lots of people find self-harm, and how deeply concerned people are that representing self-harm might in fact encourage a practice or behaviour that they find uncomfortable or saddening, whether or not that's how it's actually experienced to the people who practice it. Indeed, recently on Women's Hour, this was exactly the reason that Jacqueline Wilson gave for her avoidance of the topic. And so this seems to raise the question to me of what this might mean for experiences of self-harm. What does it mean to have an experience which, despite in fact being very common, is almost never represented around you? And I can tell you that for me, it felt very isolating and very frightening, that what I was doing, how I felt, was so dark and so strange that it couldn't be shown, it couldn't be talked about. Because it's very easy to internalise, to believe the underlying assumption behind people's avoidance of self-harm, that it is simply too troubling, too upsetting for people to bear, and that therefore you, yourself, your pain is too much to be in the world, and that instead it has to be hidden and it has to be secret. And this seems like a shame, or at least a bit of a simplistic understanding of how stories work. Because as I tried to sort of outline a bit at the beginning of what I said, I don't really think that there's any one straightforward relationship between narratives and experience. One story is unlikely to completely determine our actions, just as our own experiences don't completely determine what stories we enjoy or relate to, even though they might a little bit. And so instead, in my work, in my research, I try to move away from a sense of stories as distant from us, but also away from a sense of ourselves as simply passively receiving them. Rather, I'm looking for approaches that open up the possibility that stories themselves are active, productive forces in us and in the world, but also that we are active and imaginative in our reception of those stories and in the way we interpret and respond to them. And indeed, that's what my research is all about. I'm doing interviews, asking people how they react to stories of self-harm, what stories have meant something to them, how those stories have fitted into their own lives, whether that's in a positive or a negative way. And therefore, we can see stories and narratives not just as a space of danger, in which tired stereotypes get replayed over and over again, dooming us to live out those same stereotypes on some endless, terrifying loop, but also as a site of possibility and potential, because stories can be a place to imagine our lives otherwise, to speak into existence a life lived differently, a story with a new ending, or indeed without anything we'd recognise as an ending at all. And I think about the ways in which it might be possible to tell so many stories about self-harm, stories about difficulty and about pain and about joy and about survival and about community and about resistance and about care. The many complex, contradictory ways we try to take care of ourselves in impossible situations, and the many ways we might all take better care of one another.